When we left off, Denise Prout had just stepped out of her white Cadillac Escalade in a brand new Dior gown, parked between two signs that clearly told her not to, and taken her fourth step directly into the heart of a motion sensor buried in my lawn. Here's exactly what happened next. The sprinkler heads came up fast, the way they're designed to, popping out of the ground with that quiet mechanical click you only really notice when you're listening for it, and then the water hit. Not a gentle mist. Full pressure, full coverage, 4 separate heads firing in a coordinated arc that I'd personally tested and adjusted 3 times to make sure it covered every inch of that strip. Denise didn't even have time to register what was happening before the first jet caught her square across the back, soaking through white silk in less than a second, and the second head got her from the side, knocking her sideways half a step as she let out a sound I can only describe as somewhere between a scream and a gasp, the kind of noise you make when cold water hits you somewhere you weren't braced for it. Her clutch bag went flying out of her hand and landed in the wet grass. Her phone, which she'd apparently been holding loosely in the other hand, slipped free and dropped directly into the spray zone, where it sat getting hosed down along with everything else. She staggered 2 steps further, trying to get clear, except 2 more steps put her directly under the third sprinkler head, which finished the job the first 2 had started. By the time she made it off the grass and onto the sidewalk, there wasn't a dry thread left on her. The dress, which Pam later told me had cost somewhere north of $1,400, was plastered to her in a way that no amount of fabric in the world was built to handle gracefully. Her hair, done up in that elegant twist just an hour earlier, had collapsed into wet strands hanging flat against her face. Her makeup ran in streaks. And her white shoes, the ones I'd bet she'd picked out specifically to match the dress, squelched audibly with every step. I watched the whole thing from my front window, and I want to be honest with you, I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I felt the particular, specific satisfaction of watching a problem that had been building for months resolve itself in exactly 4 minutes, the length of time the valve was programmed to run before automatically shutting back off, which it did, right on schedule, the heads retracting back into the ground with the same quiet click they'd come up with, leaving Denise standing there dripping in the sudden, eerie silence that follows. For about 3 full seconds, she didn't move at all. Then she turned toward her own house, where her pre-gala guests had clearly heard the commotion and were now standing on her porch in various states of confusion, and screamed, at a volume I genuinely did not know a human throat could produce, "He did this on purpose." One of the guests, a woman in a navy cocktail dress I didn't recognize, actually pulled out her phone and started filming, which I only learned about later when Pam told me the clip had already made its way into at least 2 separate group chats before the gala had even officially started. Another guest, an older man holding a half-finished drink, just stood frozen on the porch steps with the particular expression of someone watching a situation he very much did not want to get pulled into. A third guest, the only one who actually moved, jogged down toward Denise with a jacket, draping it over her shoulders less out of any real urgency and more, it seemed, just to have something to do with her hands. I should mention I wasn't outside. I hadn't said a word. I was standing behind my own front window, coffee in hand, watching this unfold from a comfortable, dry distance, and yet somehow I was already, in her mind, the villain of a story where I had not so much as touched a single piece of equipment in the last several minutes. Walter came jogging down from the porch in his half-buttoned dress shirt, took one look at his soaked, sobbing wife, and made the genuinely baffling decision to immediately start jogging toward my house instead of toward her. I opened my front door before he reached it, mostly because I didn't want this conversation happening through a closed door where tone gets misread. "Everything all right?" I asked, which I'll admit was maybe not the most diplomatically phrased opening line given the circumstances, but I wasn't exactly feeling diplomatic. "Your sprinklers just soaked my wife," Walter said, breathing hard, more flustered than aggressive. "My sprinklers ran on their normal cycle on my own lawn," I said. "I didn't realize anyone was standing on it." "She's not standing on it, she's standing next to it." I gestured toward the grass strip, toward the 2 metal signs still standing exactly where they'd been for weeks, perfectly visible in the evening light. The signs have been up a while, Walter. They say private property, no parking on lawn. The grass strip is mine. I've mentioned that to Denise more than once, in person and in writing. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The signs spoke for themselves, and so did the tire ruts still faintly visible in the section of lawn that hadn't fully recovered from the last several months of abuse. Walter looked back at the signs, then back at the Escalade still sitting with its front wheels on the grass, then back at me, and something in his face shifted, just slightly, like a man doing math he didn't really want to do. He didn't apologize. He didn't argue either. He just turned around and walked back toward his house without another word, which told me more about how that marriage actually worked than anything I'd witnessed in the previous several months combined. Denise, meanwhile, had not calmed down even slightly. By the time Walter got back to her, she'd already pulled her phone out of the wet grass, shaken it off, and was dialing with shaking, water-slicked fingers. I heard her say the words, "I want to report an assault," before she even got fully through her own front door, and about 11 minutes later, a Cedar Hollow patrol car rolled slowly around the corner onto Cedar Hollow Drive, lights off, no urgency in its approach at all, which told me something useful before the officer had even parked. The officer who stepped out introduced himself as Officer Mike Daniels, a heavy-set guy in his 40s with the kind of weary, seen-it-all calm that comes from a career spent responding to 1,000 disputes that all sounded dramatic over the phone and turned out to be nothing once you actually showed up. Denise met him at the curb, still dripping, mascara streaked halfway down her face, gesturing wildly toward my house and talking faster than he could apparently process. Something about an assault, about deliberate targeting, about how this neighbor had been harassing her for months, and finally escalated to attacking her with water. Officer Daniels listened, nodded along patiently, and then walked over to introduce himself to me, asking if I'd mind showing him the irrigation system in question. I walked him over to the grass strip, pointed out the signs, the irrigation box, and pulled up the footage on my phone, the full clip from my camera showing the entire sequence. The Escalade pulling up onto the grass between the two clearly marked signs, Denise stepping out and walking directly into the trigger zone, the sprinklers activating exactly as designed, running for exactly 4 minutes, and shutting off automatically. Officer Daniels watched the whole clip without saying much, then crouched down and examined the irrigation box itself, the same way Donnie at the supply store might have, checking the wiring, the valve, the motion sensor housing. "This is a standard smart irrigation setup," he said eventually, standing back up and brushing off his knees. "Motion-triggered sprinkler valves are a pretty common product these days. People use them for deer, for water conservation, you name it." He glanced over at the signs again, then back toward Denise, who was still standing at the edge of her own driveway, watching us with her arms crossed tightly over her soaked dress. "Ma'am, can I ask you something? Did you see those signs before you parked there?" "That's not the point," Denise said. "It's actually pretty relevant to the point," Officer Daniels said, not unkindly, just plainly. "This is private property. There are 2 signs clearly marked, visible from both directions, saying not to park on the grass. The homeowner's irrigation system ran on his own property, on his own schedule, and happened to be active in a zone you walked into after parking somewhere you'd been asked not to park repeatedly based on what he's showing me here." He held up my phone slightly, where the footage was still paused on the timestamp. "I'm not seeing an assault here, ma'am. I'm seeing a man watering his own lawn." Denise's voice climbed another notch. "He set that thing up specifically to target me." "Did he ever tell you he was going to do that?" "No, but it's obvious." Officer Daniels glanced at me, and I just shrugged, keeping my expression as neutral as I could manage. "I water my lawn. I don't control when people decide to park on it." It was, I'll admit, a deeply satisfying sentence to get to say out loud to a police officer with a body camera running. He spent another few minutes talking to both of us, took down basic information for his report, photographed the signs and the irrigation box himself for his own documentation, and ultimately told Denise, in language that was about as clear as a cop is willing to get without actually citing someone on the spot, that there wasn't a criminal matter here, that this looked like a civil property dispute. and that if she wanted to pursue anything further. Her actual exposure was on the trespassing and property damage side of the ledger, not mine. He suggested, almost gently, that the situation might resolve a lot faster and a lot more pleasantly if she simply stopped parking on a clearly marked private lawn that had 2 signs and apparently several months of documented prior incidents behind it. Before he left, Officer Daniels asked me one more question, almost as an afterthought, flipping his notepad closed. How long's that irrigation system been set up like this? About 3 weeks, I said. And the signs? A couple months before that. He nodded slowly, glancing back toward the grass strip one more time, then toward the tire ruts still faintly visible in the section of lawn that hadn't fully grown back. Lot of patience for somebody who could have just called this in the first time it happened, he said, not quite a compliment, but not far from one either. I called it in plenty of times, I said. Nobody ever did anything about it until tonight. He gave a short, knowing kind of laugh at that, the kind that told me he'd seen this exact dynamic play out in plenty of other neighborhoods before, and HOA too tangled up in its own friendships to enforce its own rules until something finally forced the issue. Well, he said, tucking the notepad into his jacket, looks like tonight it got handled. He didn't say it was my doing. He didn't need to. Denise did not take that suggestion well. She didn't say much else to him, just stood there fuming, dripping onto her own driveway while her pre-gala guests watched the whole spectacle from the porch, with expressions ranging from concern to, in the case of one woman I didn't recognize, very poorly disguised amusement. The gala, as far as I know, happened without Denise that night. By the time she'd showered, dried off, and presumably had a complete emotional breakdown over a ruined $1,400 dress, the window for arriving fashionably on time had long since closed. Jenna and I went, sat 2 tables away exactly as the seating chart promised, and spent a good portion of the evening fielding quiet, curious questions from people who'd clearly already heard some version of what happened, the neighborhood grapevine apparently faster than the Cedar Hollow Police Department's actual response time. I want to be clear that I genuinely thought, for about 4 or 5 days afterward, that this might actually be the end of it. The footage existed. The officer's report existed, presumably noting his own assessment of the situation. The signs were still standing. I figured Denise, embarrassed and outmaneuvered, would simply stop parking on my lawn and we'd all quietly move on with our lives. That is not what happened. About a week after the gala incident, I got a notice in the mail from the Cedar Hollow Estates HOA, official letterhead, Carol Whitfield's signature at the bottom, informing me that a complaint had been filed regarding unauthorized exterior surveillance equipment creating privacy concerns for neighboring residents, and that I had 14 days to either remove or properly register my security camera installation or face a formal violation fee. 3 days after that, a second letter arrived, this one citing my 2 private property signs as violating an HOA aesthetic guideline about non-standard signage visible from the street, something I'd lived in that subdivision for 3 years and never once heard mentioned before, despite at least 4 other houses on my street having various signs of their own, from security company placards to a laminated, "Beware of dog," sign 2 doors down that had clearly been there since before I moved in. I called Teresa immediately, and to her credit, she sounded genuinely uncomfortable on the phone, picking her words carefully. I logged both complaints as they came in, Mark. I can tell you who filed them if you really want to know, but I think you can probably guess. I didn't even need her to say the name out loud. A few days after the second letter, a third one followed, this time citing me for excessive water usage inconsistent with HOA conservation guidelines, which I'll admit was the one that almost made me laugh out loud standing at my own mailbox, given that the entire system existed specifically to use as little water as possible by only running when triggered. By that point, word of the whole saga had spread well beyond just Pam and Russ. Someone, I never found out exactly who, posted a slightly exaggerated but mostly accurate summary of the gala incident in the neighborhood's group chat, the same one Pam used to send out the gala seating chart, and within about an hour, it had turned into easily the most active thread that chat had seen in months, dozens of comments ranging from supportive to gleeful, to a handful of people cautiously asking whether they should even be discussing an active HOA matter in a group chat at all. I stayed out of it almost entirely, mostly because Greg had advised me reasonably not to say anything publicly that could later get twisted into evidence of malicious intent. But I noticed, scrolling through it quietly one evening, that more than a few names I didn't even recognize were sharing their own quick stories about run-ins with Denise over the years: parking, noise complaints, a dispute over a tree branch, a disagreement about Halloween decorations. It was like watching a dam that had been holding back pressure for years finally develop its first crack. This is where I want to slow down for a second, because this part of the story matters a lot, and I think it's the part a lot of people in situations like mine never quite get to see through to the end. It would have been easy, at that point, to get angry, to fire off an aggressive email to the board, to post some kind of furious rant in the neighborhood group chat myself. I didn't do any of that. Instead, I called Greg again, and together we built something a lot more useful than anger: a complete, organized, undeniable record. Greg helped me draft a formal written response to both HOA notices, point by point, citing the actual governing documents of the HOA itself, the same bylaws Denise and Carol presumably assumed nobody else had ever bothered to actually read closely. It turned out, when you actually dug into them, that exterior security cameras pointed at one's own property were explicitly permitted under the community's existing security provisions, and that property signage related to legitimate boundary or trespass notices was specifically exempted from the aesthetic guideline being cited against me. In other words, both complaints against me were not just petty, they were factually, technically wrong under the HOA's own rules, and I had the actual document language to prove it. But I didn't stop there, because at this point I'd realized something important. If I just quietly defended myself and made these two complaints go away, nothing would actually change. Carol would still be running things the way she'd been running them for 6 years. Denise would still believe, correctly, that she could weaponize the HOA against anyone who inconvenienced her. So instead of just responding to the complaints, I requested, in writing, a formal emergency board hearing, citing the HOA's own bylaws regarding resident grievance procedures, a process that, as far as I could tell from asking around, almost nobody in Cedar Hollow Estates had ever actually invoked before. Teresa told me later that she had to dig through an old binder just to confirm the procedure even still existed on paper. While I waited for the hearing date to get scheduled, I kept building my case. I went back to Russ Whitman, who agreed without hesitation to write a signed statement describing his own years of dealing with Denise's parking habits, plus what he knew about Frank Castillo's Boulder situation. I reached out to Frank directly, an older guy with a slow, deliberate way of talking who seemed almost amused that someone was finally asking, and he agreed to write his own statement about the shed violation that had mysteriously appeared days after he'd complained about Denise's dog. Pam Castro gave me a written account of the Henderson family's situation as well as she remembered it, including approximate dates, which lined up almost perfectly with complaint timestamps. I was able to request from Teresa under the HOA's own records access policy, a policy that, again, almost nobody seemed to know existed until I asked for it by name. About 4 days before the hearing, Greg called me with something I hadn't expected. Denise's lawyer reached out to me directly, he said, wants to talk settlement before this goes to a hearing. I asked what kind of settlement, half curious and half already knowing I wasn't interested. Greg laughed a little. He offered to have her quietly pay for the sod and the sprinkler full restitution, no admission of fault, if you agree to withdraw the formal grievance request and keep it out of the open hearing. It was, on paper, a reasonable enough offer in pure dollar terms, the same $900 or so I'd eventually end up getting anyway. But the more Greg explained it, the clearer it became what they were actually trying to buy, which wasn't really the money at all. It was silence. No public hearing meant no public record of the pattern, no Linda Ferraro testimony, no 40 residents watching the board's own bias get exposed in real time. Just a quiet check that let everyone involved pretend this had only ever been about one lawn and one sprinkler. "What'd you tell him?" I asked. "I told him I'd run it by you, but that you'd probably want to think about whether $900 in silence was really worth more to you than however many other residents in that neighborhood have been dealing with the exact same thing for years without anyone ever calling it out loud." Greg paused. I might have also mentioned that we already had 4 separate written statements and a board secretary willing to testify, just so he understood exactly what he'd be trying to keep quiet. I didn't need long to decide. I told Greg to pass along a simple answer. No settlement, no withdrawal, the hearing happens as scheduled. Part of it was principle. Part of it, I'll be honest, was that after everything that Lorne had been through, after the broken sprinkler head and the crooked mailbox and months of being told by my own HOA that this wasn't worth their attention, I wanted it handled in a room where everyone could see exactly how it had gotten this far in the first place. This is where I want to slow down for a second, because this part of the story matters a lot, and I think it's the part a lot of people in situations like mine never quite get to see through to the end. It would have been easy at that point to take the quiet settlement, pocket the money, and move on with my life. Instead, Greg and I spent those last few days before the hearing finishing what we'd already started, a complete, organized, undeniable record. Linda was the HOA board secretary, a quiet, precise woman in her 60s who'd held that position for almost as long as Carol had been president, mostly handling meeting minutes and filing. I hadn't had much reason to interact with her directly before all this, but Teresa mentioned, almost in passing, that Linda had been the one originally responsible for processing violation notices before Carol started handling certain special cases, personally a few years back, a phrase that, once I heard it, I couldn't stop thinking about. I reached out to Linda directly, careful not to push too hard, and asked if she'd be willing to talk about how violation notices had historically been handled. To my genuine surprise, she agreed to meet me at the clubhouse on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, and what she told me filled in the last piece of the picture I needed. According to Linda, for at least the past 4 years, any complaint involving Denise Pruitt, whether filed against her or by her, had been quietly redirected away from the standard intake process and handled personally by Carol, bypassing the normal documentation Linda would otherwise have been responsible for logging. Linda had noticed the pattern years earlier, but had never felt she had standing to challenge the board president directly about it, especially with no other resident ever pushing back hard enough to make an issue of it. "You're the first person who's ever actually requested a formal hearing," Linda told me, folding her hands on the table between us. "In 9 years on this board, nobody's ever invoked that bylaw. I started to wonder if anyone even remembered it existed." She agreed, after some thought, to bring her own records to the hearing, the partial paper trail she'd managed to keep over the years despite Carol's handling of the special cases. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday evening at the clubhouse, open to all residents per the HOA's own bylaws once a formal grievance hearing gets invoked, which meant it wasn't just going to be me, Carol, and Denise in a small back room. Word travels fast in a neighborhood that size, especially after the gala incident had already become unofficial legend, and by the time Jenna and I walked into the clubhouse that evening, there were close to 40 residents packed into folding chairs, far more than I think Carol had anticipated when she initially tried to schedule it for a smaller side room before Teresa, citing the open meeting bylaw, insisted on moving it to the main hall. Russ showed up early enough to grab a seat in the front row, arms crossed, looking like a man settling in for a show he'd been waiting years to watch. Frank Castillo came too, despite mostly keeping to himself since the Boulder situation, and Pam arrived with her husband and what looked like a printed folder of her own notes tucked under one arm, just in case. Carol opened the meeting trying to keep things brisk and procedural, clearly hoping to move through it quickly with minimal scrutiny, reading off a short opening statement about the importance of neighborly cooperation and the board's commitment to fair and balanced resolution, language that felt, even before anything else happened, a little too rehearsed for a situation she was supposedly approaching with neutrality. Denise sat in the front row, dressed sharply, composed, clearly having rehearsed whatever version of events she planned to present. Occasionally glancing back at the crowd behind her like she was gauging the room before deciding how hard to push her own version of events. When Carol opened the floor for me to present my grievance, I stood up, and for the next 20 minutes, with Greg sitting quietly in the second row for moral support, I walked the entire room through the full timeline. I showed the footage, the actual clips, projected onto the screen the clubhouse used for HOA presentations, the tire tracks from the very first week, the broken sprinkler head, the mailbox incident, the minivan being waved onto my lawn, and finally, the gala night itself, the full 4-minute clip from start to finish, Denise stepping directly into the trigger zone in her white dress. A few people in the crowd actually laughed at that part, not cruelly, just the kind of laugh that comes from finally seeing something everyone had already heard about secondhand. Somebody near the back whispered, loud enough for half the room to hear, "I knew it wasn't an accident," and Carol had to actually rap her knuckles on the table to get things quiet again. I read the timeline of every attempt I'd made to resolve this through normal channels, the ignored note, the dismissed HOA complaint, the 2 retaliatory violation notices that arrived within days of the gala incident, and the third one about water usage that drew an audible snort from somewhere in the middle rows. Then I read Russ's statement and Frank's and Pam's account of the Hendersons, laying out name by name, date by date, a pattern that had clearly been running for years, not months. Frank stood up unprompted partway through, asking permission to add a few words of his own, and described, in his slow, deliberate way, exactly how the shed violation notice had arrived 8 days after his complaint about Denise's dog, and how he'd never once received so much as a follow-up letter about that same shed in the 9 years before or the several years since. "I just figured that's how it worked around here," he said, sitting back down. "Guess I figured wrong." Denise tried to interject twice, both times insisting this was an exaggerated, one-sided account, that I'd built some kind of elaborate trap specifically to humiliate her, that the camera footage was somehow manipulated or selectively edited. Carol, to her credit, or perhaps just out of procedural necessity, gave Denise her own 10 minutes to respond once I finished. Denise used most of it attacking my character rather than addressing the actual timeline, insisting the lawn strip was ambiguous shared space, a claim that fell apart instantly the moment Greg stood up, identified himself as an attorney, and read the actual property line description straight from the subdivision's recorded plat map, which Teresa had pulled for the hearing at my request. There was no ambiguity. The strip belonged to my lot, full stop, recorded and filed with the county decades before either of us moved in. Denise's lawyer, who I hadn't even realized she'd brought along until that point, a younger man sitting 2 seats down from her who'd said almost nothing the entire evening, leaned over and murmured something to her that visibly deflated whatever she'd been about to say next. That's when Linda Ferraro raised her hand. She hadn't been scheduled to speak, but Carol, visibly uncomfortable, had little choice but to recognize her once half. The room turned to look at the long-serving board secretary, half standing with her hand up. Linda walked to the front, set down a small folder of records, and calmly explained, in front of the entire packed clubhouse, exactly what she'd told me privately a week earlier. That complaints involving Denise had been routed away from standard process for years, personally handled by Carol, with documentation gaps that lined up suspiciously well with every incident the room had just heard described. She read off 3 specific dates where violation notices had gone out against other residents within days of those residents filing complaints about Denise. The same pattern Pam and Frank had already described, now confirmed by the board's own internal records. She read them slowly, deliberately, the way someone reads numbers they've checked more than once, because they know exactly how much weight each one carries. When she finished, she folded her hands and added one more thing, quietly, almost to herself, but loud enough for the front rows to catch it. "I should have said something years ago. I didn't, because I told myself it wasn't my place. I don't believe that anymore." The room went very quiet after that, the kind of quiet that has weight to it. Somewhere behind me, I heard a woman murmur, "Oh my God," under her breath, and another voice, lower, mutter something that sounded like, "I always wondered." Carol tried to regain control, insisting this was being mischaracterized, that she'd simply handled sensitive cases personally as board president, which was well within her discretion, her voice climbing slightly with the particular strain of someone who knows the room has already stopped believing her. But by then, the math in the room had already been done by 40 sets of eyes at once, and nobody in that clubhouse needed it explained to them twice. Teresa, sitting off to the side with the meeting's official minutes binder, cleared her throat and reminded the board, gently but firmly, that under the bylaws, a formal grievance hearing required a procedural vote before adjournment, regardless of how uncomfortable the evidence had made things. Carol, looking smaller than she had at the start of the meeting, called for the vote herself, since as president it technically fell to her to do so, and one by one, the other 4 board members present raised their hands in favor of the resolution Greg had helped me draft beforehand. A finding of repeated property trespass against Denise Pruitt, full restitution for documented damages, and a formal written violation entered permanently into her resident file. The vote wasn't close. 4 in favor, none opposed, Carol herself abstaining, which under the circumstances felt almost like an admission all on its own. Denise was found to be in violation of repeated property trespass and was ordered to pay full restitution for the documented damages, the sod replacement, the cracked sprinkler head, the mailbox repair, a total that came out to just under $900 once Greg helped me itemize everything properly with receipts. More importantly, the board issued a formal written violation against her for the pattern of behavior itself, the kind of mark that, under HOA rules, would follow her file and weigh against her if any future disputes arose. Carol didn't get voted out that night. The bylaws didn't actually allow for that kind of immediate removal, but the meeting ended with a separate motion, passed by a wide margin, calling for a special election to fill the board president position at the next quarterly meeting, along with a formal review of how violation complaints had been processed over the previous several years. Carol resigned 3 weeks later, before that review ever fully got underway, citing, in the brief notice she sent around, a desire to spend more time on personal matters. Nobody in the neighborhood group chat seemed to buy that explanation, but nobody pushed back on it either. Sometimes people just need an exit that lets them leave with whatever's left of their dignity, and honestly, I didn't have it in me to begrudge her that much. Denise wrote me a check for the full restitution amount 4 days after the hearing, dropped it in my mailbox without a word, no note, no apology, nothing, which honestly felt about right given everything that had led up to it. The Escalade never parked on my lawn again, not once, not even close to the edge of it. For a few months after that, things were quiet, but undeniably tense whenever our paths crossed, the kind of careful, distant politeness neighbors fall into after something like this happens. Denise stopped attending most neighborhood social events, skipped the next 2 HOA meetings entirely, and according to Pam, who genuinely seemed to feel a little sorry for her despite everything, started spending a lot more time visiting her sister out of state. About 5 months after the hearing, a real estate sign went up in Denise and Walter's front yard. They sold the house within 6 weeks, faster than most listings in that market, according to Pam's husband, who worked in real estate himself and moved out of Cedar Hollow Estates entirely. I don't know exactly where they ended up, and honestly, I never asked. The last time I actually saw Denise in person was the day the moving truck came. I happened to be out front coiling up a garden hose, completely unrelated to anything, and she walked past on the sidewalk carrying a small box toward the truck, the same sidewalk that ran right alongside the grass strip that had started this entire thing. She glanced over at the lawn, fully recovered by then, thick and green with not a single tire track left anywhere on it, then glanced at me, and for just a second I thought she might actually say something. She didn't. She just kept walking and I kept coiling my hose, and that was that. No closure speech, no apology, no final word. Just 2 people who'd spent the better part of a year tangled up in something neither of us probably expected, going their separate ways without ceremony. A young couple named the Abernathys moved into the house a few months later, friendly, quiet, the kind of neighbors who wave when they see you out front and don't park anywhere they shouldn't. Funnily enough, the first week they moved in, I caught myself watching a little too closely whenever they had guests over, an old habit I hadn't quite shaken, before realizing there was nothing to watch for anymore. Their guests parked properly along the street every single time, no exceptions, no surprises, and after a few weeks, I stopped paying attention altogether, which honestly might be the most satisfying ending of all, just going back to not having to think about my own front lawn every time a car turned the corner. The grass strip along Cedar Hollow Drive fully recovered over that following spring, thick and green, no more ruts, no more crushed seedlings, just an ordinary, healthy patch of lawn doing exactly what lawns are supposed to do. I kept the sprinkler system installed exactly the way it was, motion sensor and all, though I'll admit it's mostly just decorative at this point, sitting there as a quiet little monument to the whole ordeal. Russ still brings it up sometimes when he's out trimming his hedges, calling it the most expensive lawn ornament in Cedar Hollow, and I've actually helped two other neighbors set up similar systems of their own over the past year, neither of them dealing with anything quite as dramatic as my situation, mostly just deer and the occasional stray dog, but the principle's the same. Sometimes the most effective solution to a problem isn't a louder argument. It's just patience, documentation, and excellent timing. Carol, last I heard, still lives in the neighborhood, but keeps almost entirely to herself now. No longer involved with the HOA in any capacity. The board elected a new president that following quarter, a soft-spoken retired teacher named Howard Greer, who, in his very first newsletter, included an entire paragraph reminding residents that all complaints would now be logged through Teresa's standard intake process with no exceptions, a sentence that felt, to anyone who'd sat in that clubhouse the night of the hearing, a lot more meaningful than it probably read to anyone who hadn't. Jenna still brings up the gala night every now and then, usually when we're telling the story to new friends who haven't heard it yet, and she always ends it the same way. Mark didn't do anything, she says, grinning. He just watered his own lawn. And honestly, by the time the whole neighborhood, the police, and an HOA board hearing room full of 40 witnesses had all independently come to the exact same conclusion, that's really all there was left to say about it. Thumbnail text suggestion, 10 words. She parked on my lawn, my sprinkler ended her night.